Shabindiki, Gora Premanandi. Is there a reason for this verse?
Saw your Bhagavatam. You put a note on the Bhagavatam.
Huh?
We're waiting for you to tell it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a nice verse. There's many nice verses. This is one of the many. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya. Naram Chaiva Narottamam. Devim Saraswatim Vyasam. Tato Jayam Udirayat. So text 21, Canto 1, Chapter 2. Vidyate Hridaya Grantish Chidyante Sarva Sangshayaha Chiyante Chashakarmani Drishta Evatmanishvare Vidyate Hridaya Grantish Chidyante Sarva Sangshayaha Shiyante Chashakarmani Drishta Evatmanishvare. Thus the knot in the heart is pierced, and all the misgivings are cut to pieces. The chain of fruit of actions is terminated when one sees the self as the master. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Attaining scientific knowledge of the personality of Godhead means seeing one's own self simultaneously. As far as the identity of the living being as spirit self is concerned, there are a number of speculations and misgivings. The materialist does not believe in the existence of the spirit self, and the empiric philosophers believe in the impersonal feature of the whole spirit without individuality of the living beings. But the transcendentalists affirm that the soul and the supersoul are two different identities, qualitatively one but quantitatively different. There are many theories, but all these different speculations are at once cleared off as soon as Sri Krishna is realized in truth by the process of bhakti yoga. Sri Krishna is like the sun, and the materialistic speculations of the absolute truth are like the darkness, midnight. As soon as the Krishna sun is arisen in one's heart, the darkness of materialistic speculations about the absolute truth and the living beings is at once cleared off. In the presence of the sun, the darkness cannot stand, and the relative truths that were hidden within the dense darkness of ignorance become clearly manifested by the mercy of Krishna, who is residing in everyone's heart as the Supersoul. Paragraph. In the Bhagavad Gita 10:11, the Lord says that in order to show special favor to his pure devotees, he personally eradicates the dense darkness of all misgivings by switching on the light of pure knowledge within the heart of a devotee. Therefore, because of the personality of God as taking charge of illuminating the heart of his devotee, certainly a devotee engaged in his service in transcendental love cannot remain in darkness. He comes to know everything of the absolute and relative truths. The devotee cannot remain in darkness, and because a devotee is enlightened by the personality of Godhead, his knowledge is certainly perfect. This is not the case for those who speculate on the absolute truth by dint of their own limited power of approach. Perfect knowledge is called parampara, or the deductive knowledge coming down from the authority to the submissive or receiver, who is bona fide by service and surrender. One cannot challenge the authority of the Supreme and know him also at the same time. He, the Supreme, reserves the right of not being exposed to such a challenging spirit of an insignificant spark of the whole, a spark subjected to the control of illusory energy. The devotees are submissive, and therefore the transcendental knowledge descends from the personality of Godhead to Brahma, and from Brahma to his sons and disciples in succession. This process is helped by the Supreme within such devotees. That is the perfect way of learning transcendental knowledge. Final paragraph. This enlightenment perfectly enables the devotee to distinguish spirit from matter, because the knot of spirit and matter is untied by the Lord. This knot is called the ahankara, and it falsely obliges a living being to become identified with matter. As soon as this knot is loosened, therefore, all the clouds of doubt are at once cleared off. One sees his master and fully engages himself in the transcendental loving service of the Lord, making a full termination of the chain of fruitive action. In material existence, a living being creates his own chain of fruitive work and enjoys the good and bad effects of those actions life after life. But as soon as he engages himself in the loving service of the Lord, he at once becomes freed from the chain of karma. His action no longer creates any reaction. The chapter 2 of first canto is a summary of the process of devotional service, step by step by step. And of course, this is one of those steps. The goal, what's the goal? Well, the goal is not liberation. The goal is knowing Krishna, because within knowing Krishna, liberation is already achieved. So one need not worry about liberation. So although it's speaking of the chain of fruitive work, which binds us to not liberation, to the repeated birth and death, say it the other way. Repeated birth and death is established by the chain of fruitive reactions. And fruitive reaction arises from fruitive action. And fruitive action arises from a desire to be an enjoyer of Prakriti. And the desire to be the enjoyer of Prakriti is the fruit of misuse of free will, or the covering of false ego. Or the false ego is awarded to someone who misuses their free will. And once misusing free will It's self-perpetuating. When you misuse free will, that indicates a desire to be a separate enjoyer, because proper use of free will is to engage in the service of the master. After class, the young American fellow that was there came and asked a question. His question was, how did we get here? How did it become so implicated in darkness when the nature of happiness is so attractive? How did we get here? And they were like so deeply interwoven in that complexity. It's part of the fruitive actions, but the fruitive actions are they're in cycles, or time moves in cycles. So one of those, just like day and night, that's a cycle. Then the next day, and then months, and then years, and with the turning of the seasons. So time moves in cycles: small, medium, big, 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 big. So one of those cycles of time is a cycle of the 4 yugas. And in the cycle of 4 yugas, I just explained this to him in reply. At the beginning of Satya Yuga, it's mode of goodness. Mode of goodness means mixed with passionate ignorance, but not prominently goodness. But what happens, supposing you have a vat of paint, white paint, and you put an eyedropper's worth of blue and an eyedropper's worth of red and stir it. It's off-white. Not terribly, but it's off-white. And the very nature of fruitive reaction is passion, red, and ignorance, blue. They get a reaction. So then it becomes not just one eyedropper's full, but it's 2. And then you keep moving that mix of goodness mixed with passion and ignorance, because there's always competition and there's always a mix. It becomes darker and darker and darker. The vat of white paint becomes colored. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And it becomes no longer white. It becomes mixture of red and blue. And that's the movement of the 4 yugas. The mode of goodness diminishes, the mode of passion and ignorance increases. And this is Kali Yuga, which means mode of ignorance is becoming more prominent than in the previous yugas. So it's just darker. And just by living in this atmosphere, it's dark by design. And then the solution isn't go back to Satya Yuga, because after Satya Yuga comes the decline again. And how does things move from the darkest, ending point of Kali Yuga? What happens at the end of what's the mark of the end of Kali Yuga? Kalki Avatar comes and chops everybody. And Vyasadeva, who's not visible to the modern eye, he descends from Badrinath, and he, along with his associates, they commence the next Satya Yuga. And then it's mode of goodness again. So think from the bottom, up, and then Satya Yuga. So the decline is gradual. What the next yuga is all the way up. So we're experiencing the products of fruitive actions within the modes of nature, and it gets darker and darker and darker. And it doesn't get easier. It gets more difficult. More difficult because, using Prabhupada's language, the atmosphere is surcharged with opposition. It's not easy. But here we are, and we have to, best use of a bad bargain, we have to make the best use. And the process of counteracting, this is an important teaching. The process of counteracting past fruitive work that's in the direction of darkness. Canto 6 begins with a discussion about prayaschitta. Prabhupada explains that in all religions of the world, there's some process of atonement. In the Catholic Church, they have their process of atonement, and any ism, any religion has a process of atonement, this and that and the other. The Vedic system as well. However, atonement is inadequate. Why? Because it works, but tendency remains. Like you do some gardening. You can clip the weeds at the top, but the weeds still have a root. So after you clip the weeds at the top, they're going to grow because they've got a root. Without removing the root, the weeds are going to grow and keep growing and keep growing. So prayaschitta is like clipping the tops of a weed, but the tendency still remains. And so sure enough, at the end of the 5th canto, one of the things that's in the 5th canto is cosmology. And one of the parts of cosmology is describing, towards the end of the 5th canto, is the hellish planets. It's not a nice place, and it's described. So that ushers in the beginning part of the 6th canto. Maharaj Parikshit asks Shukadeva Goswami, yikes, this darkness of the hellish planets and so much suffering, what can be done to relieve the persons who are in that so much suffering position of their reactions? And it's not just people that make their way all the way down to the hellish planet, it's all of us, because there are unwanted miseries that come along with being in this world. We just accept it, with our shrug of our shoulders. That's life. But it's just life because we bought into the program of fruitive work. And what keeps the fruitive work program going? The modes of nature and false ego. So how to end? So it's not just not clip the weeds at the top. The very root has to be pulled. And what's the very root? The tendency for separate enjoyment. What's the antidote for that tendency? Devotional service. And that's what this Canto 1, Chapter 2 is saying. By the process of devotional service, misgivings about what? Misgivings about who we are. Well, what are some examples, please, of misgivings of who we are? Well, the materialists have theirs, and the impersonalist has theirs. And there's varieties of materialists, and there's varieties of impersonalists. Although the impersonalists say it's all one, there's varieties amongst them. Some say this and some say that. explicitly, the impersonalist does not make a distinction between the living entity and the supreme. Therefore, it's all one, and therefore we're supreme. And there's this Shruti mantra and that Rig Veda mantra that verify this is reality. There's no individuality. There's only the supreme, and we're that. We're the supreme. That's a misgiving. That's not true. I mean, it's a polite way of saying it's false, or it's rubbish. It's a misgiving. So the verse and purport indicate as soon as knowledge of who we really are comes, as soon as the light comes, darkness is dispelled. And the light dispels the darkness of ignorance of who we really are. And we understand who we really are, that's the fruit of bhakti, because who we are is not just an entity, but we're entity in relation to the bigger picture of things, like the supreme. And there's so many little living entities, little sparks from a big fire. And that's reality. And the part is meant to serve the whole. Varnashram, which is a topic that we're going to be discussing this evening. Varnashram, we're going to be speaking about it this evening because it's the end of the seventh canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. You know, not so long ago, we were all celebrating Lord Nrsingadev's appearance day. That's in Canto 7. And when that whole narration of Lord Nrsingadev and Prahlad and everything is concluded, then comes this discussion based upon a question of by Maharaj Parikshit to Shukadev Goswami. You mentioned the Varnashram system. Could you expand and explain it more fully? So there's 5 chapters. And what's Varnashram in with a very simple depiction, it's a social structure. So that conditioned souls, those that are implicated in false ego and fruitive work, can gradually become purified by recognizing their tendencies, subordinating their tendencies to Dharma, and follow Varnashram Dharma. The Dharma, the Varna, and Ashram, the occupation that matches my nature, and the ashram that matches my social position. Just like yesterday's verse, stane statuk. Stay in your position. You don't have to give up your position. So whatever your position is, know what your position is. Engage in what is natural for that position, or dharmic for that position. And then one needs to know what the dharma is for this and that and the other position. What's the dharma of a sannyasi, which is different than the dharma of a grahastha. It's different than the dharma of a brahmachari, in terms of ashrams. And then varnas, similarly, differences. So it's a social structure that brings gradual elevation. But the gradual elevation doesn't mean it. Gradual elevation doesn't mean that the tendency to be a separate enjoyer vanishes. It helps, but it doesn't mean that the force that brings repeated birth and death, the fruitive work tendency, driven by false ego, which is awarded to a living entity who wants to enjoy separately, that has to go. And varnashram doesn't mean it's going to go. It's a social structure that enables one, depending upon association and circumstance, to become more in the mode of goodness. But more in the mode of goodness isn't transcendence, because goodness is mixed. It's the same problem. A lighter version, but the same problem. Doesn't mean don't do it. It doesn't. But it means that that's not the solution. If that's not the solution, what's the solution? Devotional service. Particularly starting with hearing and chanting. That's the emphasis in the whole of the Bhagavatam, and it's the emphasis in this chapter. The process of bhakti begins with the process of hearing in the qualitative way that one hears. Qualitatively means how receptive one is. And then also what's that source of that vibration that one's hearing, from which one is hearing. And if there's a proper alignment, then the misgiving completely gone. The bondage for fruitive activity completely gone. False ego completely gone. If false ego is completely gone, what's left? What's left is the soul of who we really are. We'll say it the other way. Supposing you don't know who you are, then you're driven by false ego. And then there's diversities. This type, that type, the other type, and subtypes of those types, and complexity of material existence. False ego. False ego is the first material element awarded to a living entity, and it's the last one to go. And we don't see it, but we can experience and see its effects. If you know by knowledge, you can know, like, a disease. If someone has something symptoms, you can know what the disease is. You may not be able to see the smallpox disease or bacteria, but you can see the symptoms. So you know that the disease is there because of the symptoms, and so forth. Objects that are not perceivable with our senses can be seen by the characteristics of how that something that can't, like on the mind. Who's seen a mind? Or who's seen an electron? We know about electrons, but who's seen one? But we know about its effects. Put your fingers in the socket. That's electricity. Its effect. So what's the effect of fruitive action is misgivings and bondage, and diversities and diversities. So he just gave two in the purport, gave two. The materialist this, the impersonalist that. And then subdivisions of those, the complexities of misgivings, can be false ego. In the a very nice way of saying the same thing is in Canto 3, Chapter 26, I think. It's Kapila Dev describing devotional service. Pure devotional service, that's the title of the chapter. So he describes devotional service. In the course of describing devotional service, he says something similar to what's here. Language is different, but he says that bhakti has the power to dissolve the subtle body. Bhakti has the power to dissolve the subtle body. And if what's dissolve means, it's just like, it's an energy, but its binding force upon the living entity ceases, or the energy isn't created or destroyed, it just dissipates, goes somewhere else and does something else somewhere else. Matter isn't created or destroyed. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's, Einstein's idea, but it's true. Prabhupada speaks of the same idea. So I'll say it again. According to Kapila, bhakti has the power to dissolve the subtle body. That means the mind that we hang out with all the time, it's gone, dissolved. Material intelligence dissolved. False ego gone. The subtle body gone. So what's on the other side of no more subtle body? There's still mind, intelligence, and false ego of the soul. It's just the covering is taken away. The bondage to fruitive work is taken away. That's what this verse is saying. Misgivings are dissolved, and one can see oneself properly as the servant of the Supreme. The self is the master of the body, but this there's the body, there's the self, and there's the Supreme Self. So the self is the master of the body, and then the self is the subordinate to the Supreme Self. But all of that can become understood through bhakti. But if you start with the misgiving, there's only Brahman. There's no living entity, or the living entity is the Supreme. I'm God, you're God, we're all God, because there's only one thing. You just start with that. There's only one thing. Interesting. How did God fall into illusion? We're an illusion. I mean, there's many questions that don't have answers. It's interesting statement, but it's not defensible. So this is chapter 2 of Canto 1, just establishing ABC, the ground rules for the rest of the Bhagavatam. The process of devotional service is extolled and honored and glorified and described how it works. False ego, dissipated, finished. The material mind, gone. What does the material mind do? According to Bhagavad Gita, the material mind does two main things. The material mind thinking, feeling, willing. Those are from the platform of the mind. Then comes action, but before there's action, there's contemplation, a feeling about that which you're contemplating, and then some resolve. It comes into better focus. Willing, I want to get rid of. So we involve ourselves in matter based upon the mind. Thinking, feeling, willing. Or accepting and rejecting, another way of saying sankalpa, vikalpa. Then another function of the mind is carrying conceptions of life. Various conceptions of life are carried by the mind, just like the air carries aromas. It's a very good example. For a number of years, I was living in New York. And one of the places that we would visit was there's a university in Staten Island. Forget the name of the place. So to get there, you have to go down this expressway, and the expressway is downwind from the garbage dump. So the people in Staten Island don't like it, but the garbage, there's two dump places. One is dump in the ocean, another is this big mountain of garbage in Staten Island. People from New York City, the garbage trucks come and dump their garbage in this big mountain. And it's meant to decompose. And when it decomposes, it stinks. So you're downwind from this mountain of garbage, and it's the wind carries the aroma. As the wind carries aroma, the mind carries conceptions of life. It's very vivid. By the ocean, there's a different smell, fresh, etc., etc. And a garbage dump is in a botanical garden has it. There's a fragrance that's within the wind. As the wind or air carries aromas, the mind carries conceptions. And as we have conceptions, then that's weighted. It's weight of the false ego, and then we do stuff, thinking, feeling, willing. So those are. So supposing all that's gone, supposing the mind is dissolved, we're going to panic because that's me, but it's not me. It's a covering. The conceptions that's within the mind is not me. We're the observer of the conceptions. We have thinking, feeling, willing based upon what's going on in the mind. Anyway, there's a process that's bondage. There's different ways of analyzing or describing, but the end of the day is not just liberation, but reviving our relationship with Krishna. So the bhakti process, it's head on, straight, forward. Engage in our devotional service to Krishna. So here we are, conditioned souls, engaging ourselves in the bhakti process, and with some degree of faith and confidence, we're going to get on the other side of the struggle. And meanwhile, we're struggling, striving to stay focused on the means to overcome the struggle. The struggle of, back to the language of the purport, the tendency for fruitive activity, and bondage to material existence that comes from that tendency. It's a very strong tendency. It brought us here and it keeps us here. There are Sanskrit terms, the throwing potency and the covering potency. Two types. Throws us and keeps us. Fruitive. I want to enjoy. So it's not that we have to take a dagger and stab the tendency for being an enjoyer and kill it. But it just transfer the enjoyment to bhakti. That is, Krishna is the enjoyer, and that gives me enjoyment. And it's the quality of that enjoyment is so different. One is bondage, and the other is liberation. One is light, and the other is darkness. Two different positions. We want Krishna to be the enjoyer. So that's the bhakti principle. And one engages in that bhakti principle, misgivings of fruitive work and misconceptions of self, they're taken. As darkness cannot stand in the sunlight. And that sunlight, that's like the light of the Bhagavad. Such an important verse in chapter 3. This Bhagavad is the light in this dark age of Kali to dissipate the sufferings of living entities. That's the purpose. We're suffering because of ignorance. And what's the antidote for ignorance? Knowledge. Darkness is fearful. The absence of darkness is light. So Srimad Bhagavatam gives us that light of transcendental knowledge of who we are, who is the Supreme, and how to love Him. So I'm going to end abruptly. See if there's some discussion. Canto 1, Chapter 2.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj.
That one works. Yeah.
So, Maharaj, in the process of devotional service, in practicing the process of devotional service, so there are many instructions we have to follow from Sadhu and Shastra.
Yeah.
So, while following those instructions, sometimes if we want to go in deep and follow strictly,
Good.
then that is sometimes it will impede other relationships or other activities. And if we don't follow, it's hindrance for us, ourselves. And to balance it, it's kind of, going on a razor. It's very difficult to balance everything and going forward. It's always challenging. So how do we practice?
Well, I don't like the word balance. And I don't like the word balance because the conception is, I call it the two-pocket program. So much for Krishna, so much for me. So much for Krishna, so much for me. Me, Krishna, Krishna. And how do I balance? I don't like it. It's Krishna, Krishna. So now, how do you regulate your activities, which isn't balance? But it's there. Of the things that are to be done, there's superlative priority things that are to be done. And those superlative priority things that are to be done, that start with hearing and chanting. And then, flows from that many other things. So, but don't compromise. As you go further and further, those things become less important. So there's some things that are absolute and some things that are not as absolute. Because it's going to be presented, at least the first part of it's going to be presented this evening for the Chinese devotee audience. The Varnashram system. There's descriptions in the Varnashram system that is part of the Bhagavatam, and where it describes the duties of a brahmachari and how a brahmachari should dress. And, the deerskin or the barks of a tree. Okay. And is that as absolute as Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu Smaranam? It's in the Bhagavatam, but there's gradations of what's important. So I'm responding to the balance question by saying things that are superlatively important, you make sure you do all those things. And if some of the other things that are also to be done don't get done, it's okay. It's not like, now I've got it, and I've got a license to do what I want to do. We do things that are in alignment with Dharma, but the principle is, Sarva Dharmam Parityaja Mamekam Sharanam Braja. That one takes care of all the other subordinate ones. So of those things, let's say cleanliness. Is it okay to compromise on cleanliness? Then there's degrees of being compulsive and, inordinately strict with cleanliness. Some people become, they're obsessive compulsive. And it's a disease. That some people can't help it because that's the disease they have. So within reason. Now what's that? That's quite vague. What's within, as we discussed yesterday, similar response to this, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's discussion with Raghunath Das Goswami. In a moderate way, you engage in your worldly activities. And, in a moderate way. So the thing not to neglect is the inward cultivation. And if you give proper attention to the inward, what's the inward cultivation? It's the bhakti, the purpose of my doing or not doing, accepting, rejecting. The purpose of my existence is that Krishna is to be pleased. And inwardly I'm cultivating that. That's the bhakti principle. And if you inwardly cultivate that day after day after day, then the balance question takes a back seat. Because vidhis, or regulations, are to assist one thing. They're not in and of themselves standalone principles. There are some in and of themselves standalone principles. Being connected with the Supreme through the dedication of self, Tanuvan Manobir, dedication of self to the Supreme and the topics of the Supreme, and you don't compromise with that as best you can. Then it's time management, not balance.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj, thank you for the wonderful class. So one question I had was, so when the mind is dissolved or the false ego is dissolved, we understand ourselves. So is it at the same time we understand our
Yes.
relationship with Krishna? Or
Yeah, yes. I mean, the understanding relationship with Krishna is gradual because there's no end. There's no bottom to that ocean. It's an ocean without a bottom. So it's ever increasing, but it's immediately the darkness is dissipated, the light's on. And then the light gets brighter like the rising of the sun.
so we will know our Swarup.
In course of time, we'll understand the starting point. The starting point is to understand I belong to the category of spirit, not the category of matter. And you move step by step in that direction, and then the details of what our spiritual form and identity is become disclosed in due course of time. It's self-revelatory.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. Just coming back on that balance.
Which one?
I don't like the balance too, but
Oh.
I just want to say something about it. Because we know as a devotee, we have to put Krishna in the center of our life. Then sometimes we have house chore to do, because the house is a temple in a way. I mean, that work become devotional service.
Yeah.
I mean, put Krishna in everything become perfect. That's the balance.
Yeah, it's not balanced. Okay.